Hey everyone, I have Wendy Bohon with me. She is a geologist, a well-trained PhD in the subject of shaking around the country and what is going on. She likes to talk a lot and focus a lot on the earthquake scene. And so, Doctor, I want to bring you in here and tell us a little bit about. Now we're recording, I think I just saw them update like 10 earthquakes in the last 24 hours, which is unusual. I mean, I've been in South Carolina 31 years and we just have never had this kind of reporting on it and attention paid to it. So, talk a little bit about what we're experiencing. I think I've heard you call it on social media a swarm.
Yes. So generally, when we think about earthquakes, there's a main shock, which is a biggish earthquake followed by lots of little earthquakes called aftershocks. An earthquake swarm is a little bit different because there is no main shock, there's no big earthquake. In this case, you've had about seven magnitude. Three plus earthquakes over the past 7 months. And each one of those earthquakes has its own little aftershocks, which is why you're having 10 so far today. Those are aftershocks of the magnitude three earthquakes yesterday. But there's not one bigger earthquake that's happened. It's more lots of earthquakes happening in the same general area over a certain time frame, but they're all around the same magnitude, in this case, magnitude threes. We usually see swarms in places like California, Nevada, areas that are very seismically active, but they happen all over the world. In fact, in 2010, there was one in Arkansas. So you're not the only place in the South recently ish that has had an earthquake swarm. They do happen.
That's right. And you've talked about I found you on I think TikTok and Twitter and every platform, YouTube even, talking about the swarm concept, but that having it come without the precursor of a more major quake is unusual. And the question is, I mean, are they studying this? Are they wondering why is South Carolina being paid attention to?
Oh, absolutely. So, the University of South Carolina maintains a seismic network in South Carolina. They put a seismic instrument near where those earthquakes started happening a few months ago. The USGS right now is deploying portable seismic instruments into the area, really, so we can study what's happening and see exactly what's going on below the surface. Earthquakes are less frequent in the Midwest and on the East Coast because we're not on a plate boundary. So the place where the plates come together in the US, that's California, Oregon, Washington. That's where we have the most earthquakes. But we do have earthquakes, across the country. We had a 5.1 in Sparta, North Carolina a few years ago. There
Yeah.
was the magnitude 5.8 in Virginia in 2011. So they do happen. And South Carolina has a couple of felt earthquakes every year. Certainly not this many, but
Hmm.
it's a good reminder that everywhere is earthquake country, and the
Yeah.
things you want in your earthquake kit very similar to what you want in your hurricane supply kit. So we're coming up on hurricane season. It's a good reminder just to make sure you're prepared for anything that nature can throw at you.
And I put up the fault line map for South Carolina just to give people an idea. You know, obviously, I guess there are fault lines pretty much most places, but South Carolina has a few, and they have talked about because people hear about 100 plus years ago, 150 years ago, the earthquake in Charleston that was a 7+ magnitude quake, a really big quake, and at a time where we weren't building buildings to sustain or survive that kind of thing. Things have changed a lot, right? First of all, this system, this swarm that's going on, has nothing to do with the fault line related to Charleston.
No, there are several areas in South Carolina that frequently experience earthquakes. One of them is near Charleston. One of them is up further towards the northwest, and then you have this area where you're having most of the quakes now. So they don't seem to be these earthquakes don't seem to be associated with the areas of seismicity that were associated with the Charleston earthquake. These are natural earthquakes. They're not associated with mining or quarrying or anything like that. It's just you have these really ancient fault lines all across the East Coast from, the continent slamming together millions of years ago. The
Hmm.
the stress in the crust is always building up, and occasionally you just have that stress and that tension being released. It's almost like an old house settling.
Yeah. And when people get worried about this, there's a bunch of chatter online about it being, somehow it's mining, it's, gas production, but uh, the SEMD, our emergency preparedness folks in South Carolina, have been debunking all of these, theories that are out there because this stuff is not happening in the state to create this kind of problem. Do you agree?
Absolutely. The South Carolina Emergency Management is doing a phenomenal job getting information out there. And it's totally understandable that people are anxious right now. These are things that are a little bit outside of most people's experience. Even if you've lived in South Carolina your whole life, you may not have felt earthquakes before.
Hmm.
So it's absolutely understandable that people are nervous. But don't worry, earthquakes do happen if you are nearby where they happen often. So, like down in Charleston, it's likely that you felt an earthquake. My best friend lives in Charleston and she calls me every time there's an earthquake, which makes me happy because I get to talk to her. But
Yeah.
you know, they do happen, people do feel them, but it is anxiety producing. Something people can do to take a little of that control back and alleviate that anxiety is know what to do when you feel the shaking. Make sure if it starts to shake, you know to drop down to your knees, take cover under a sturdy object like a table and hold on. Things can fall on you. If you have a tea set or some valuable items up on high shelves, maybe move them to the lower shelf just so they don't break. Taking little steps can help you get some control back and can alleviate that anxiety.
And with most of the activity being far from the part of the state we are in, which is the upstate of South Carolina, um, you've talked a little bit about how earthquakes feel when you're close versus when you're far away. So when you're closer, when you're in the Midlands, the Columbia area where these things for the most part have been centered so far, you're going to feel something different than you would feel the more rolling wave up here in the upstate. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So it's almost like if somebody throws a boulder in a pond, the
Hmm.
waves that are biggest are closest to where that goes in. That's like the epicenter of the earthquake. So people that are closer to the earthquake will often describe it as jolting or jarring and kind of violent. People that are farther away are going to feel more of those what we call long period waves, like the bass from a car going by, right? So it would feel more like a rolling earthquake. They're just describing how far away they are from where that earthquake occurred. Now, an interesting fact about the East Coast and the Midwest is that an earthquake that happens on the East Coast is likely to be felt over a much broader area than an equivalently sized earthquake on the West Coast. And that's just because
Interesting.
of the properties of the crust. So, a lot of people are going to be feeling even these fairly small earthquakes. They're shallow, which means they're close to where people are on the surface, and the rocks on the East Coast carry the seismic waves really well.
And so a 3.6 earthquake in our area could go how far in terms of feeling it?
Well, it wouldn't be unusual for people in North Carolina to feel it, for people even maybe down into Georgia to feel some really light shaking.
Wow.
It would definitely be felt across the state. What you feel also depends on the kind of structure you're in and the
Hmm.
kind of soil and rock that that structure is built on. So if you're down on the coastal plain where you have lots of soft sand and soil, that's
Hmm.
almost like jello. So you'll
Oh,
shake a
wow.
little bit harder in those areas than you would if you were up in the mountains and on bedrock.
Gotcha. All right. So let's talk just one more thing about global warming because I've heard people, wondering, does global warming play a role? What do we know about global warming and earthquakes in general? Like, are we expecting to see more or less of them because of the warming of the air?
So earthquakes start miles below the surface of the earth.
Okay.
And generally, the things that are happening up here don't really have a whole lot to do with them. It doesn't really impact them. We do see things like ice quakes, which are when the ice breaks and almost like an earthquake that we can measure. We do see an increase in ice quakes, but we don't really expect to see an increase in earthquakes.
So, as far as the swarming goes, how long should South Carolinians kind of expect this to go on? I know it's unusual, so it be different than the normal swarm?
Well, they're going to continue until they stop.
Hmm. So
I
there's
don't
the
know what's
answer.
going to happen.
Yes,
Nobody can predict earthquakes.
right.
Swarms usually last a couple days, a couple weeks, maybe a couple of months. In California, there was a swarm that lasted for 4 years. That had thousands of earthquakes. Most of them were magnitude threes. There was one magnitude four, but
Wow.
it can go on for quite a while. So people should be prepared to feel more shaking, probably shaking that's equivalent to what they've been feeling. So just
Okay.
expect that you might feel that. Don't get concerned or worried about it. Just know what to do when you feel it. Be prepared, know that it might come. And eventually, what usually happens is these will just die away.
And do we know anything about what led up to the Charleston one? I know that was so long ago, and the record keeping was so different. Did they have any discussion about precursors or anything that would have indicated that was coming?
Not that I've heard about. It was a long time ago. There weren't seismic instruments to record the
Right.
shaking. Most of what we know from that earthquake come from written reports and pictures. And
Hmm.
so trying to untangle that and figure out, what exactly was happening and when is difficult. That's one of the interesting things about earthquakes is that
Yeah.
the more we can learn about them, the more we can understand them, the more we can figure out, this happened in the past, so this could potentially happen in the future. So there's a lot of interest in, mining these historic records, but it can be really difficult to get the information.
And when it comes to what we're doing right now to grab that new information, you talked about them putting out, I guess, is it more seismic readers or I mean, what exactly are they out there doing in the field right now?
So they're deploying more seismometers, which are instruments that measure the shaking of the ground from anything, from
Okay.
earthquakes, from bombs, from quarry blasts, from people walking around. In Alaska,
Hmm.
we can see bears walking next to the
Really?
seismometers. They're very sensitive. But the more of them you have, it's almost like the pixels in a camera.
Hmm.
The more pixels you have, the higher resolution picture you get. The more seismometers we have in a particular area, the higher resolution picture we get of the ground underneath the seismometers. So by putting more seismometers in this particular area, we should get a really good picture of what's happening underneath the ground in order to figure out, why are these happening? Where exactly are they happening? And what's going on down there in the ground below our feet?
All right. Well, I appreciate you joining us. Dr. Wendy Rocks is what you are on most platforms. I think on is it TikTok that you're different? I think it's Dr. Wendy Rocks It, right?
Yeah, it was taken. Give it back.
Oh,
Whoever has it, give it
come
back.
on. Yeah, it's yours. I'm telling you, you own it. But we appreciate your insight. You are all over the place trying to spread good information, and we really appreciate you taking time to talk with me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy.
Thanks.